for Accountability of Internet Governance Venues. My name is Robin Gross with IP Justice, and the other co-facilitator today is Farzi Baidieh. And welcome. Let me give you a little bit of background before we get started. This session is a follow-up to the one that we held last year on accountability of internet governance venues. And we're doing a follow-up to that session now and exploring the formation of a dynamic coalition to continue to evolve this discussion over the course of the next few months or the next year or so. So we want to talk about some of the basic objectives and basic criteria of accountability and the basic kinds of mechanisms that are available and what's effective and what's not effective, and hear a variety of perspectives from different stakeholders on the needs of those stakeholders for accountability in these venues. So let me get started with our first, where's Jeanette?
There you are, okay. I didn't see where you landed.
Let me introduce our first speaker today. What we're going to do is we're going to have a few presentations and then we're going to have questions at the end and discussion at the end. So if you've got questions, please save them until the end. Our first speaker today is Jeanette Hoffman, who's a professor. She's the Director of Internet Policy and Governance at Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. And she's going to talk to us about the importance of accountability in these types of venues. Jeanette?
Yeah, thank you, Robin. I thought I'd just sort of provide a bit of the bigger framework of why this dynamic coalition is really a good idea for the whole area of internet governance, not just for the IGF. What I'd like to say is that globalization implies that more and more decisions nowadays are taken outside of national jurisdictions. And also, in addition to multilateral organizations and processes, a growing number of efforts are emerging which are sort of private sector-led and not any longer under control of national governments. And this, what many people refer to as the rise of private authority in transnational regulation, means that many of the safeguards we have developed on the national level in terms of constitutions simply are ineffective. They have no teeth, they don't apply. And that means that for private authority and the organizations who try to exercise that, they have to come up with their own means of looking for legitimate solutions and means that help others to hold them accountable. And that often creates sort of strange situations in an organization. Of course, they want to be in control, but they have to sort of be answerable to other parties, be it users, clients, governments, whoever. But how do they do this? Do they want to hand over control to people they cannot control? Obviously not. So it's not easy solutions that we see for this problem. Most would agree in principle that it is good to be accountable to other organizations, also to create a stable regulatory environment. But how to do that and who is supposed to decide how it is going to be done, we can see with ICANN right now how enormous tensions are created in dealing with this problem. And I think that this dynamic coalition would be good in sort of working on that.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Our next speaker is John Schulte, who is at the university, a professor at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and he's going to talk to us about what he sees as some of the key criteria for accountability. Jan?
Okay, thank you, Robin. Thanks all. And apology also, I'm in absolutely no demand at the IGF, but the two things that I have to do have been booked at the same time. So I'm going to give my remarks, and then there's no reflection on anything here. But this session was actually moved in time, so I'll go to the other one after that. Anyway, yeah, I've been involved in accountability questions as one of the accountability advisors on the current IANA transition. So that's where I've come in. But these remarks are more about accountability in general, and I guess they're just Schulte's 9 questions really. One is what accountability actually is, and a one-liner is just to say accountability is processes whereby actors answer for their impacts on others. Processes whereby actors answer for their impacts on others. That's where you start. And then you can ask, well, what makes up accountability? And I always think about accountability consisting of 4 dimensions. One is transparency, because you can't answer to people if you can't be seen. The second is consultation. You can't answer to people if you don't talk to them. Third is evaluation. You can't answer to people if they aren't reviewing what you do. And the fourth is redress. So when you make mistakes, you answer for those mistakes and correct them. Now, for me, that's all 4 of those dimensions. People sometimes get a bit hung up on the review and redress and forget about the transparency and consultation a bit. Maybe also good to ask what accountability is for, because people go to accountability for different things. Maybe they want people to comply with the law. Maybe they want people to have good financial management. Maybe they want people to listen to the democratic accountability. Maybe they want people to have moral probity. So, Paul Wolfowitz does things that he shouldn't do, and then he's removed from office. Just to remember that accountability is for various purposes, and you kind of want to ask yourself what's the relative priority amongst those purposes when they clash, because sometimes you can't actually satisfy all of them at once, and then it gets political. Who is accountable for what is maybe the fourth question. In internet governance, that's quite tricky, because there's so many cooks in the pot, or cooks in the kitchen of internet governance, that it's often not very clear who should be answering for certain actions or omissions. You've got so many intergovernmental, private, regional, global, local, national. I mean, there's more institutions than you know what to do with. So which one is actually answerable for a particular fault is open to debate sometimes. Then there's the question of to whom they are accountable. If you've actually figured out who's accountable, to whom are they accountable? And that can be a mess as well, because there can be a whole range of stakeholders, ranging from business to civil society to governments to intergovernmentals, etc., etc. And again, who are you answering to? We often get a fudge by talking about the community, which is a way of not asking that question. But anyway. Then there's through what mechanisms do you get the accountability? And there you can have a unilateral veto of the US government. And I think most people say, well, that's probably not the best way to have accountability of a global public good. You can have intergovernmentalism and go through the governments. Or you can go through the multi-stakeholder policymaking. You can go through deliberative forums like the IGF. And I suppose if all else fails, you can take to the street. And I guess in practice what happens is that accountability works through a mix of those mechanisms. And again, it just gets messy. Last couple of points, because I was asked to keep this brief. Then there's the question of how effective are the mechanisms? Do they achieve the desired outcomes? Do they attract compliance? A big one is how equitable are the mechanisms? And I was in a session before, and Arun was making comments about how equitable the mechanisms are. All the affected parties heard. So again, we've got lovely talk in internet governance about consensus and community and public interest and bottom-up processes, and it all sounds very cozy. But whether it actually fulfills those criteria of equity is something that I think one has to ask about. And then finally, the question that's also preoccupied the CCWG in the IANA transition, how accountable are those who exact accountability? So who watches the watchers? You end up, I think, getting circles of accountability and mutual accountability, so everyone has to be accountable at some point, including those who say they're holding the other ones accountable. That's me. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan. Our next speaker is Farzi Badaei with the Internet Governance Project. Farzi.
Thank you, Robin. So Yan kind of covered what I wanted to say, so I'm just going to be very brief. The Internet governance organizations and venues normally have various mechanisms, either formally or informally, to hold them accountable. And this dynamic coalition is formulated to look at a wide variety of these mechanisms. So they could be like going to court or arbitration, or it could be like private dispute resolution, or through multi-stakeholder processes to hold the organization accountable. So at the next stage of this session, we will hear the mechanisms that different IG organizations have in place.
Thanks, Farzi. Our next speaker is Erica Mann, who is a board member with ICANN, member of the board of directors. Erica.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Robin. Such a pleasure to be here. Let me maybe briefly summarize and explain a little bit what is already at place. And then I'm sure we will have later a discussion and a debate, what do we want to achieve in addition to what we already have. So I think what is very interesting, so when I joined ICANN about 5 years ago, and I was in international politics 15 years before, so I was used to work in very international environments. Was a member of the European Parliament, and always worked on trade issues and issues related to internet or telecom regulation. So what is fascinating is that when you look and how much already evolved in the ICANN ecosystem, it is really astounding, because you will find very few, if at all, bodies, which have this idea, first of all, to create something quite novel. In a way, the whole organization and all the related stakeholders want to work together, and how they want to develop policies. In a political world, you have typically a quite arranged policy arena. They are the regulators, and then they are the ones which want to help to shape policies. It's either the classical lobby list or NGOs or whoever it is. In this world, you see all these ecosystems, the different one, merging together into one ecosystem, which is in itself something very novel and very fascinating and interesting. Of course, one has to be clear, because of the novelty of the character, what we do, this creates always tension. Because none of our, I would say, of the, the way we as an individual community, an individual stakeholder in this process, we have our own views, we have our own history, we typically have our own viewpoint about a certain topic. There are different industries and different sectors involved, so naturally there are tensions which arise. But I must say, when you look back, and I can look back now 5 years, and I was involved before, so I'm overlooking quite a long time. So I would say the way we find and solve conflicts is actually fascinating, and it's something many actually have an interest in understanding if it isn't something one could copy. Now, when you look and I would recommend everybody who is not totally familiar with the way we work, the publication about the accountability of ICANN is actually quite good. So when you look into the website, and I would recommend you go to the website of ICANN.org, resources/accountability, you find a very good overview about the structures. And there are 3 pillars in reality. So one is and they all fall under the accountability mechanism. So one is the accountability mechanism. The second is what we call organizational reviews. And the third is what we call the affirmation of commitments and the related reviews. So these are the 3 pillars. And these 3 pillars guide us in our process. They have many, topics related to it. I just don't want to go into detail, but just to give you some flavor and some idea. The organizational review, it's fascinating because these are the different the technical community, the business community, the CCNSO, all of them are working and have their own string of accountability strings. And they all feed back into the organization. So it's like a system, like a breeding system in the ideal phase. So one organization feeds back to ICANN management, to the board. It goes back again, and then hopefully one day there will be a solution everybody finds, which everybody can live with. That's the ideal scenario. It's not always working like this, and I'm sure we will talk about this later. So my recommendation is look at these three pillars. You will find accountability, transparency strings. You will find information about competition and consumer trust there. You will find information about, for example, the ombudsman as well. We have an ombudsman, quite often forgotten the function and the role of the ombudsman. And then what is fascinating as well, again, you find this on the same page, are examples. They're not complete, but they're examples of accountability and our transparency practices. And again, just maybe few, because we tend to forget and overlook what kind of achievements this actually is, what we have achieved over time. So there's one thing which the public comment. So all the stakeholder communities, they will, when they have a policy change or they need consultation, they will ask for comments. They will allow the public to comment on it. Again, it's not something you will find in many different environments, very few actually. Something totally different, which looks so natural to us now, but when you look back in the history, it was actually a quite complex process to evolve. Languages or external participation, which again opens a different window and a different door into our processes, because it allows people to participate who can't travel or who don't want to travel because of whatever reason. They can participate. This was a long process. I remember when the first time we had this done, that we have these external video, the possibility to have external hubs being present. It was quite complex actually for our technical team to manage and to run it. Now it looks natural. We are getting used to it. So I'm just mentioning this because you will see when you look at this, there's so many mechanisms in place, and somehow, and this is maybe the human nature, we always want more. This is just the way we are, and it's good. It's a good process. So I just wanted to mention what we have so that we are reminded, and then looking forward, I'm sure you will make a short introduction what we want to discuss. Thank you so much for inviting me again.
Thank you very much, Erica. Our next speaker is Paul Wilson from APNIC, and Paul's going to talk about some of APNIC's accountability mechanisms. Paul?
Thanks very much, Robin and Farzi. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks. I'm from APNIC, the IP Address Registry for the Asia Pacific, and we're a member of what's typically referred to as the technical community. And I want to talk about how accountability works in our environment and in the ecosystem around us. I could talk for a while about this, and I think I've got 5 minutes or so. I hope I'll be able to cover it pretty well in 5 minutes, which shows you that I hope you'll see that we've got pretty straightforward accountabilities where we are. The work that we do is in a sort of internet tradition. We're actually relying on a lot of what's happened before, and that tradition has involved an openness by default. What I'll say about APNIC is not particularly unusual in that sense, but I'll show you how that's actually evolved over the last 10, 20 years. APNIC is one of 5 regional internet registries, so the technical community is quite diverse, but the 5 regional internet registries are fairly similar to each other. What we do is we are responsible in each of our respective geographic regions, 5 regions. We're responsible for the allocation and management of IP address space, V4 and V6, and autonomous system numbers, which is another critical numeric internet resource, for the registration of those resources in public registries, and for processes like transfers and management of the holdership of those resources. We've been going as a system since the early 1990s, when the RIRs were created out of the IETF process as a action of that community, and have been formed in the years since then, some of us for more than 20 years. And today we cover a membership of over 30,000 amongst us in total, 30,000 of the ISPs and network operators that build the internet around the region. So we do a pretty important job, and accountability has always been an important part of what we do. Each of the RIRs is obviously an incorporated legal entity, and we are all formal membership organisations. So we've got pretty standard membership-based mechanisms for things like electing boards, for reviewing annual reports and activity plans and budgets and so forth. You won't find any great surprises in our structures in terms of being basic membership models. We don't exactly follow the same model, however. We're all bottom-up organisations, so as you can imagine, 5 membership organisations could each evolve differently as time goes on. So there are things that we do differently in terms of accountability. So in the case of APNIC, for instance, we have an annual formal financial audit which is available to members, and that's a voluntary but full financial audit. We, every 2 years, conduct a formal independently run survey of our members and stakeholders and make the reports and the responses to that available. So some RIRs do things along those lines or a little differently. Some of them have got board structures with particular subcommittees to take charge of different parts of the governance of their organisations. We've actually, as I say, evolved somewhat differently, but in fact, just in about the last year, we've seen the focus on accountability brighten and sharpen, mostly due to what's happening in the ICANN framework. And we again voluntarily found that it would probably be useful for us collectively, since the RIRs work together to maintain this system of IP address management. We felt it would be useful to publish a comparative matrix of our accountability mechanisms and structures. So there's now on the website of the NRO, the Number Resource Organisation, which is our sort of umbrella body, you'll see a matrix of all of the respective accountability mechanisms and how they compare across the RIRs. Now, so that's at the organisational level. We have, as I say, legal bodies with transparent membership-based structures. We also, in each of the 5 cases, facilitate in different ways according to our specific community requirements and desires. We facilitate an open policy development process, which is not restricted to members, but is open to the entire community of our region. And that's a bottom-up consensus-based policy development process where each of the RIRs, currently on a 6-monthly schedule, twice a year, will host and coordinate a policy development forum, a meeting in which the community members can come together and make decisions, proposals, discussions and so forth on policies that become binding on the RIR in terms of their management of the resources that they're responsible for. And so in that, I think in that case we follow a sort of similar tradition of absolute openness and freedom to participate in those processes, as I mentioned in terms of our membership structures. We maximise access to those meetings, particularly these days through remote participation, video broadcast, through captioning, through recording of transcripts and keeping them available on the website for future reference and all that stuff, in order to make the processes as transparent and as accountable as possible. So if you think of the 5 RIRs, we hold 10 of these meetings per year, thousands of people potentially who are participating in those meetings directly, remotely and through open mailing lists as well. I'll just mention we do work in the ICANN context, and there is a link to ICANN through our regional policy processes, in that there is a global policy process which allows 5 regional processes to converge on a single global policy as needed, and that policy is handed to ICANN for its implementation through the processes of the address supporting organisation. So The supporting organisations, if you're aware, were an original part of ICANN's structure, and since ICANN was basically founded, we have had the Address Supporting Organisation as the mechanism for taking policies into ICANN. That's fairly important at this time because that ASO structure is pretty clear. There's a very clear separation of the policy formation from the policy implementation, and the implementation is by IANA within the ICANN structure. And that actually, I won't be talking right now about ICANN accountability, but that structure has made the accountability question for the numbers community much, much simpler for us than for the names, where there are many internal structures within ICANN and external and so forth. I think over the last 20 years, the RIRs and as members of the wider technical community have changed and put more focus and more attention gradually onto openness, transparency and accountability. I think back in the earlier days, 20 years ago, we were open, but it was passively open. Now, the doors were open, and if you knew the door was there, you could come through it, no problem at all. But definitely for the last 10 years, we've taken a much more intentional and active approach to making sure that people know about the door and that it's open, and that when they come in, they can expect to participate and to have access in ways that are predictable and documented and formalised to the extent that we can. And so I sort of see the difference between simple passive openness and a sort of conscious multi-stakeholder inclusive attitude as kind of like the difference between a sort of a neutral non-discriminatory approach and an anti-discrimination or affirmative action sort of approach, where you've decided that you're not just passively open to being where you want to be, but you're deciding where you want to get to and taking actions accordingly. So that's all I wanted to mention for now. Thanks, Farzi. I'll hand it back.
Thank you, Paul. Our next speaker is Azumi Okutani from JPNIC. Azumi?
Thank you. My name is Izumi Okutani. I am a policy liaison in JPNIC. So we are a national internet registry in Japan that is under the APNIC region. So we pretty much do the Japanese version of what APNIC does. So we collaborate very closely with APNIC, of course. And in addition to our role as the number resources registry, what we do is we actually share these discussions around the number of resources, the domain name, or recently around the wider internet governance issues that may be of an interest for the Japanese community. So first thing is to make sure that they actually keep up to date about the discussions. And the second is that we want to have the voices from the Japanese community reflected back to the wider overseas, from the Japanese perspective, community. And so I've been more familiar with the number resources community because I've been working on this arena for over 10 years, and I'm relatively new to ICANN or IGF. So I want to share like a little bit of observation about the differences between these communities. So in our case, since the RIRs are more regionally structured, and also APNIC is very recognizing that many in the region has linguistic, cultural diversity. They don't assume that everybody thinks in the way of English-speaking people, or even if people are not as vocal or not eloquent, there's this atmosphere. It's all right. So it actually makes it easier and encouraging for those who actually want to speak. And JPNIC also have this own national forum that actually have discussions around the policies discussions in the Asia-Pacific region. So we can actually feedback what's been happening and discuss in our own language, and then give our feedback to the APNIC community. So at the beginning, when I first joined the APNIC forum, there weren't many participants from Japan who are active, but now, as a result of these better collaboration between our national community and the regional community. We now have people making presentations, making proposals in APNIC forums, even people, some of them even chairing. So this is something that I see as an interesting development. And so compared to that with ICANN or IGF, it's a global platform. So I think it's a common issue. I mean, it's not because, it's not a fault of a particular forum, but I think it's the way that it's formatted that it makes it challenging to reflect the views of different people from different regions, and of course English is spoken, so it's easier for it's not just about the language or being able to speak, but language actually is very closely related to how you think or how you act. So the process and the kind of discussions is very influenced by English-speaking kind of people, and it's not intentional that it's that way, but I think those people who speak English, it helps to be super conscious that you know, there are people who think differently, and maybe, I don't know, start from thinking like speak slowly, or think about other ways that accommodates participation. For example, this morning, I think there was an approach that was suggested that people don't necessarily feel comfortable to speak openly at microphones, and it sometimes helps to have like separate dialogue in smaller groups. So these may be the kind of things that would actually make it easier and for people to express opinions. And so how we can actually improve things in platforms that only has like communities or places where it only has a global platform. I think it's not realistic to split them into different forums. So maybe having like a sub-meeting or sub-community that actually allows people in regional or national basis and have discussions. And then if there's a way to feed those discussions into a global platform, that actually might make it easier and encourage people to share their views. So I already see this partially happening within ICANN, for example. I think they have like regional hubs, and then they have meetings that people get together on regional basis. And I see, like I attend the Asia Pacific ones, and I see people who don't usually speak so vocally in like wider sessions, they actually share their opinions. But there's actually, the people who are there are only from that region, so they don't get to, you know, others don't get to hear it. So if there's a way we can actually, you know, feed the discussions there into sessions or, I don't know, forums where wider ICANN participants participate, that might be something helpful. And maybe similar thing can be said about the IGF. So, I mean, there's a lot of recognition around national and regional IGFs already. And I think the challenge is that how do we actually feed the discussions that's happening there into the global IGF in an effective way? So it might be something that we can think a little bit more about.
Thank you very much, Izumi. So we've heard from some of the key players in the global governance accountability frameworks. Now let's hear from some of the stakeholders and some different stakeholder perspectives on accountability. Let's start with Keith Drazik, who represents the business community, or I should say is a member of the business community from VeriSign. Keith?
Hey, thank you very much, Robin. Hi, everybody. My name is Keith Drazik. I work for VeriSign. I also participate in the GTLD Registries Stakeholder Group, which is part of the GNSO, the Generic Name Supporting Organization at ICANN. So, Robin, I think I'd like to start with maybe just some high-level views about accountability and sort of some of the processes that we follow in terms of public input and the things that I think are critically important, and maybe where I've seen things improve over time. And then I can speak more specifically about the experience of GTLD registries, our engagement in the GNSO, or anything else that anybody wants to talk about. So in brief, I think one of the key components of accountability and transparency in a internet governance framework, or in the context of a registry operator participating in the policy development processes that we work in, is the importance of public input. There needs to be an opportunity for review, and accessibility is critical at the review stage. If a topic has been discussed and or is under discussion in a working group or in a community process, there needs to be the opportunity for newcomers and for anybody that's interested to review the work and to contribute. But part of that review and contribution to the work underway is having the accessibility to be able to understand, to have appropriate language support, and to make sure that, and you know, in terms of making sure that people from different cultures and different language backgrounds have the opportunity to engage. The next phase is the opportunity for input. There need to be appropriate tools for, after the review and after the understanding of the work at hand, to provide input. And whether that's a public comment period or some other phase or stage of the community engagement, you need to have the ability to provide input, and you need to have the tools to be able to do that. And then comes the assessment phase. Once public input is provided, there needs to be an assessment. There needs to be a consideration. There needs to be an evaluation of the range of public comments. And at that point, you need whoever's doing the staffing work, it's a community member or an ICANN staffer or whomever it is, we need to acknowledge every input. We need to show that every individual input, everything that's been submitted, is at least acknowledged. It doesn't mean that everything has to be acted on or incorporated. And that's part of the difficult work of staffing and difficult work of going through the consideration and the assessment phase and developing a consensus position. But everything needs to be acknowledged. And then at the end, the output coming out of any public input or public comment process or multi-stakeholder working group is the output needs to show our work. We need to clearly be able to demonstrate that the inputs were considered and assessed and acknowledged, and then there needs to be a clear explanation as to why things were accepted and incorporated and why certain things weren't. And I think the key there is that for those who are coming to these bottom-up, consensus-based, multi-stakeholder processes, there's a risk that people provide input, but feel like their input was ignored. And that's a risk, because that's the first opportunity to lose a newcomer who may be very interested in engaging, but feel that they're not being heard. So at a high level, I think those are the sort of the critical steps or phases or commitments that we need to make as those who are involved in these types of processes. I will say that in my experience in ICANN, that each one of those, I think, has gotten better over time. There were times in ICANN where you didn't know whether your comments were being considered. You knew they may have been ignored, and you couldn't tell why. But I think that there's been a dramatic improvement in ICANN, in the ICANN community, certainly within the GNSO, that we have a lot more visibility into the process and the work. And a lot of that is a testament to the work of the staff. This is hard work, it is difficult work, it's time-consuming work to do the public comment period assessments, and I think there's a clear commitment at ICANN today to make sure that that work is done and that it's done transparently and clearly, and that people understand how we got from point A to point Z, or wherever you stop on the continuum. So I could talk more about GTLD registries. Let me just comment. In the context of the accountability CCWG, it's actually also what I've just described as the approach that the CCWG itself has taken in terms of assessing public comment, taking input, doing the assessment, acknowledging input, and showing the work in terms of the output. I think, and so the CCWG accountability, I think, has shown and has reflected what ICANN itself has been doing in recent years. So I think that's a really positive development. Now, I can talk about GTLD registries and the fact that we have accountability through contracts, which is somewhat unique in the ICANN sphere. Unlike CCTLDs, GTLD registries have contracts. We have accountability built in, going both directions. There's accountability for ICANN in that contract. There's accountability for us as registries. And there's registrar accreditation agreements that flow down those obligations and the accountability mechanisms. Happy to talk about that if anybody would like. And then certainly we can talk more specifically about GNSO policy development processes if we like. But I'm going to stop there and hope that we get some questions from the room and from the remote participation.
Thank you very much, Keith. Our next speaker is Joyti Pandey from the Center for Internet and Society in India, and she's a member of civil society, so we'd like to hear a perspective from civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Legitimacy and accountability are critical issues for civil society organizations and for governance mechanisms. It's hard to imagine democratic values of governance, especially multi-stakeholder processes, without active civil society engagement. Therefore, accountability becomes very important, given that there are often competing interests and incentives when there are various stakeholders negotiating within a certain ecosystem. So from the civil society perspective, in my opinion, I see three aspects for why accountability is important. First, civil society organizations are important for monitoring and see the level of reforms and what the authorities have done, and in reality, how much progress the authorities have performed in this sense. Through these steps, the role of civil society on the decision-making bodies grows. The reputation of organizations that lead governance for the internet as legitimate and accountable stewards of those missions is vital to their ability to recruit allies to their cause and maintain their positions as stewards. If these stewards leave questions about their legitimacy and accountability unanswered, they risk undermining organizational identities and capacities that depend on these voluntary commitments often. This then becomes a policy lever for civil society to push for further reforms. Second, whenever there is regulation or governance, there is an exercise of power. And in order to prevent abuse of power, there needs to be accountability. Accountability, therefore, empowers civil society to negotiate with other stakeholders. And these negotiations can happen both in terms with private companies through contractual obligations or with governments. And an example of this would be the surveillance program in India. Third, civil society organizations often mobilize people and resources through commitments to social values and missions that enhance the public good. The existence of transparent and accountable systems often becomes the only way that civil society can actually participate and engage in these processes. So from a method of engagement perspective, accountability becomes really essential tool for civil society. So in conclusion, developed and strong civil society is one of the guarantees of democracies. Through its active participation, following the work undertaken by the authorities, performing analysis, and by participating, civil society assists the authorities in pushing for reforms and makes the steps needed for creating accountability that is totally necessary for good governance. That's my 2 bits on it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jorge Cancio, a representative from the government of Switzerland, to give us a perspective of somebody from governments. Jorge.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you for the invitation to this meeting. I haven't prepared really a statement or a well thought out point of view of governments, but I would share some ideas on a personal basis. If we are talking about IG venues in general, I think that in order to have a discussion about accountability, we have to look into the basic elements of each of these venues, because depending on what the venue does, the organization does, what its mission is, and what interests are affected, the accountability structure will be very different. So that's a very important thing, and of course, if of those interests, public interest or public policy issues are affected, then there is a role for governments, a role which may be on a regulation basis, on a participation basis, on an oversight basis, or on a laissez-passer, laissez-faire, laissez-passer basis with judicial exposed control. That's may be very different depending on the organization we are talking about. Whenever we have identified the interests at stake, probably it's an interest, especially in the international environment, and when we are talking about organizations which affect the global public interest, that the most fullest extent of the diverse interests are fully included, and that I think in the discussion this came up, what have been the moves and also the efforts of some of the organizations to bring into the organization people from other parts of the world, people with different cultures, with different languages, and we see a process which is improving over the years, but it's certainly still a challenge for many of the organizations, because if you look into really the very active participants, or those who are in a position of shaping the decisions, there is still a room for improvement. So once you know who are the people who are relevant, you have to look also how they may be represented, because it's very different to have direct interests, specific interests, which may probably be very well organized, and we remember what Mancur Olson wrote, it's much more easy to represent direct interests than diffuse or general interests. So who is representing the people affected? And how do we make sure that they are in the processes and in the structures which are needed to do what the organization at stake has to do. And then we get into the more, let's say, specific or sometimes reactive tools of accountability, good governance, redress, transparency, openness, fairness. How do we handle that? And certainly I don't know whether 10,000 emails or more in the CCWG accountability discussions. In the end, after all the stress, it's a school of how to come up with solutions which are sensible to many different people. And on the many different people, it's a challenge, because some of the organizations are more homogeneous, perhaps in the very, very technical field. You have the engineers, and well, they may be personally very different, but they have a common background and they think similarly. be it in Japan or be it in Europe, they have something in common. But although they may be diverse because of their culture, but if you have, like in other organizations, you not only have engineers, but you have politicians, you have policy people, you have people with economic interests, you have the business sector, you have civil society. It's putting in a basket pears, apples, oranges, and it's very difficult to come up with a system and structures and processes where all these people may have a say, and the final outcome is regarded as fair and equitable by all the participants. And if you add to that what Jeanette said at the beginning of the session, that this is an international and a global context, the challenge really grows to a very high level. So I will let it with that, and I hope that these thoughts have been of some use. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorge. So before we talk more specifically about the Dynamic Coalition, let's see if there were any questions from people in this room or from remote participants, if we have any. So if there are any questions, please just come on up to one of these microphones and feel free to, or comments, it doesn't have to be a question, feel free to queue up if there are any. Did we have any remote participants? Okay, here we have a question. Go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Nadir Al-Araj from the Arab IGF AMAG. I'm not talking, I would like to thank Verzana for inviting me for this, and I could see the ambitious objective and thank for formulating the topics, and you covered the different issues of that have the good governance, the accountability. But I was thinking from as a MAG member from the Arab IGF, I could feel that it's hard, like even within the AMAG, I can't really, there is no possible to have accountability. So you are talking about ICANN, there is being achieved way ahead building this, but as the role of this coalition, I don't know how you are going to influence the different bodies, not just ICANN, which is already formulated, which are already have its own structure. That's my point of view.
Thanks. I think that's a really good question, sort of what would be the strategy or how would we influence what some of these different internet governance venues are. Does anyone want to take that one? Anyone? Erica.
No, I mean, just maybe it's very difficult. This room is so big and so long, so I'm not sure if I really understood your question well. So I want to be careful. I think when you look at the internet, the way we operate as ICANN, we have a very small responsibility, a unique but a quite small responsibility, very technical as well, very novel in many ways. When you look at what Keith was mentioning about the new GTLDs, which is practically a kind of pioneering work in even in our domain name world to some degree. So I think this is something which one needs to look at. And then, of course, there are so many, over the last year, so many internet business, new business models and evolved. Sometimes they are connected to it. Some of the other internet players think maybe there's a connection. In other ways, in other sectors and areas, maybe they're departing and have different ideas and want to do something different. I think we are all in a process of figuring out, how this, this whole ecosystem, or how one wants to call it, will evolve. We are all part of it to some degree, all with our own responsibilities. Now, when you looked into the broader world, how we connect, as ICANN, we have a connection, for example, to the what we call the iStar. So these are, again, quite like ISOC, but many others as well, which are quite unique. IETF, which is much more IAB, which are much more technical in nature. So yes, there are corporations. Sometimes there are even contractual arrangements between the different players in this world. So these kind of relations exist. And then, of course, there are the layers around. Some of them are embedded into our world, which makes it so unique. The governments, for example, they are really sitting a part of our the ICANN system, and defining their policies, infusing their topics and their policy into the consultation process, so that we find a consensus, an ideal world and a consensus approach. But then, of course, there are governments which are maybe not participating, or organizations which are relevant as well. So I think you raise a good question. So how can we bring and how can we see this whole world, if I understood you, being connected and shaping maybe for the public interest in an ideal way the best policies?
Yeah, may I comment? Nadra, there is the point, because you're mentioning that even with your scope of future work, you are going to include the IGF, but I could see the relation with the RIR and CCTLD and ICANN, but also because already these are kind of well structured, but including your scope also with the IGF, it's going to be hectic work.
I mean, speaking of the iStar organizations, I didn't even know that this sort of gathering existed before they made the Montevideo statement that suddenly brought them on the agenda everywhere, right? It was a meeting of organizations. Since, I mean, I knew about the existence of each of the individual organizations, but that they would meet and sort of write letters to the US government or anything of that, I wasn't aware of that, and I would not say that this is a very accountable way of dealing with the community. But I wanted to bring up another point. If we look at other policy domains, usually accountability is defined between those who make policies and people outside of that policy domain. I would say, in fact, that the whole idea of national constitutions is that equally powerful players try to hold each other into account. But when you look at the internet governance space, it seems that it's always the same people who talk to each other. I'm exaggerating a bit, but it is a bit like that. No, I mean, look at the people here on the panel. You might have seen us many times before. So I'm just wondering whether it's not a bit of self-serving what we are doing here.
What's the conclusion?
I'm not concluding anything. I'm just questioning an approach to accountability that we are pursuing so far. Is it really enough that the people who sort of share problem perceptions, a sort of appetite for self-regulation as opposed to something else, there are lots of, how shall I put it, shared norms that empower the people who are playing relevant roles in that space. Is that good enough, or would we actually need to think of accountability mechanisms towards people outside of this space?
Thank you very much. Paul, did you want to add something?
I'm not sure if I do. The iStar group met, I think, 3 times before the Montevideo Statement, as people and organisations do, and that was certainly not a secret meeting. In fact, we each reported back to our communities what seemed relevant to report from those discussions, and the very first time we decided to do anything jointly as a public correspondence was the statement you refer to. So I like to think we live in a sort of permissive society where we should be allowed to talk to one another and meet together if we feel like it, and so forth. No, no, says Jeanette. But I think I think the thing that we see at IGF is an example of, across the board, is an example of a term that I learned only during those WSIS days, which is that one of subsidiarity, which recognises that the world is a complex place, and the best way to deal with a whole set of complex issues is to put the solutions into the hands most closely to those affected. So I don't think we can really ask for or hope for a single coordination. I think we've got to be comfortable with the concept of subsidiarity and the idea that there are many communities and many layers and many different, often overlapping organisations and structures, and that subsidiarity is the idea that we are self-determining in some independent manner. I know Jeanette has said we have an appetite for self-regulation, and sure, there is an appetite for self-regulation that also comes within that model, but it also doesn't deny the possibility that that there are certain things for which self-regulation doesn't apply. But I would deny that there should be external regulation on the ability of a few organisations to get together and talk to each other.
I didn't talk about regulation.
Okay.
I need to correct that. I didn't talk about regulation. I said being held accountable by people not part of being part of the community. That is something else.
I think accountability is contextual. If I'm accountable to you, then if I'm accountable to someone, then I am I am able to be called to account to that person for the thing I'm accountable for. And I think we often miss the fact that there are other accountabilities. There may be accountabilities to the wider community, and I don't deny that at all, but I don't think it's useful to accept that suddenly we are all by default accountable to everyone, or that simply doesn't work.
Great discussion here. So, shall we? Well, I think Nigeria also asked us about the effectiveness of this dynamic coalition in general and what we are going to do and how we are going to do it. So I think one of the good objectives of this dynamic coalition is that we reach the outsiders and we ask them their opinion. And that this was like one of our purposes to do the dynamic coalition and have this session to talk to the outsider out of ICANN accountability process and understand their views and ideas as well. As to how we can change the organizations by this dynamic coalition, I would say that's a very ambitious task that I don't. We can discuss their mechanism, but I don't know how we can measure our effectiveness that way. And so if we can go to the general discussion about how we can go forward with this dynamic coalition, what would be the objectives, what do you think we missed out and we need to add, that would be great.
Thank you, Farzi. That's a great segue to sort of how to operationalize this coalition. So we have set up a mailing list, and we'd like to encourage anyone to join if you're interested in participating in this discussion. And so you can find that mailing list on the web at http, it's at mailman.netgov-accountability.org. So if you go to that website, you will see how to join, or you can send me an email to robin@ipjustice.org, and I would be more than happy to add you to the mailing list. but we do need to sort of talk about, as Farzi has said, what should be our core objectives and what should be our focus and how should we sort of go about getting this more formulated and developed so we can do some work between now and the next year's IGF and perhaps some intercessional discussions between now and then, and come back next year with a much more full plate of issues. So let me just open it up to that. Does anyone want to just talk to any of those points? Yes, about the future. Yes, please, down here at the end. Go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Judy Okite. I wear many hats, so for now I will wear the hat of DICAD, Dynamic Coalition for Accessibility, all right, and Disability. I think one of the very important things that you may need to do is to make it clear. For myself, when I was coming here, when I read the title, Accountability of Internet Governance Venues, my thought was physical venue, right? So I think that would be important to make that very clear, that that is not what we are talking about, because at some point I got very lost when I'm hearing about ICANN and I'm hearing about, and I'm thinking, okay, we are talking about the venue here? Yeah, so that clarification would be good, thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Actually, that was a question I wanted to ask because venue is a very legal term that we use normally when there's like a policy or a law made in a certain sphere then, or an organization, we call that a venue, a law-making venue. So we came up with the word, but I think we need to change that. And that's a very good point. Thank you very much.
I just want to say something because I think you said something really relevant. Because we always live in our little bubbles, you know, and everything for us is so natural. I mean, whatever we discuss and debate in our little own worlds, the ICANN world, the technical world, the domain name world, and the IGF world, so we have our little bubbles. And we tend to forget there's a world outside of it. I mean, we are part of it, but we still tend to forget. So I think reminding us, it's very helpful. I think it will be still good, you know, to hopefully, you know, we're not frustrating you too much, and hopefully you will have some interest in being part of this debate. Would be nice.
So my next question would be, which organizations should be the focus of this dynamic coalition? Can we also focus on CCTLDs? I think that's Martin Boyle there. So Martin, I wanted to know if you have any opinion whether CCTLDs could be the subject of the dynamic coalition on accountability. Thank you.
Quickly tries to hide his chewing gum so he doesn't choke over it. Martin Boyle from Nominet, the .uk Internet Domain Name Registry. I think there is probably quite a significant difference between a CCTLD, which works in a very clear legal jurisdiction, and the wider policy-making framework of an international framework. Certainly, and just using Nominet as an example, we are under UK law. We devise our policy working with our local community, and that includes the government, but it also includes civil society, technical community, and businesses. We could be subject to local regulation if the government were so to decide that we were behaving in an anti-competitive manner. Now that seems to me to be a rather different framework to one where you cross international boundaries and you need to bring together a very much wider community to decide whether you meet or fail to meet that sort of general accountability that was talked about earlier. I think there's one area where there is a slightly different position, and that is inevitably the IANA service. For there are a number of CCTLDs, by all means not all, who see the forum for developing policies associated with the IANA as being something collectively in the venue that is the CCNSO, to use your terminology. Like a previous speaker, I don't like the term venue at all, but then I'm not a lawyer, thank God. In that particular case, yes, you're in a collective environment because essentially the rules that the IANA functions operator will use to carry out changes have to be defined, and in this particular case are defined within ICANN, although I could name quite a number of CCTLDs who that would not see ICANN as having that authority. And certainly for CCTLDs, because the vast majority of us do not have contracts with ICANN, essentially the current arrangement is that ICANN performs a service for the community, and some CCTLDs, again probably a goodly number of them, pay voluntary contributions to cover the cost of that service, plus also the policy forum within ICANN. Does that answer your question?
So your answer is no.
Well, I thought you might like me to explain why my answer was no.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. That did answer my question. So we are going to focus on binding. Sorry. Oh, you have a comment?
No problem. No problem. I just wanted to comment that if we are going to enter into this business of discussing accountability of different international, I guess, internet governance organizations, it's always good not to reinvent the wheel and look for best practices applicable, for instance, to international organizations, to INGOs, because there's a lot of work being done on that, and we can certainly profit of that work. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, please. We have a question or comment from the audience.
It isn't a question so much as a comment and a negative reaction to there are organizations that somehow are excluded from being looked at for accountability. For example, some CCs may indeed stay within their national borders. Many don't. Many of them go out there and act like international, things to be sold on the international market. I think that if the DC is going to presume to go around looking at the accountability factors of organizations involved in internet management, stewardship, governance, whatever word we want to use, there shouldn't be any sacred cows. And the fact that some organizations might be under national law shouldn't really make a difference. Certainly, that's something you would have to take into account in terms of looking at it, that it does what it does, perhaps because of international law or national law, and therefore that's an extenuating circumstance, or that's a constraint it behaves within. But to say that, you know, you're going to look at some things but not all things seems to me a mistake. Oh, we can take turns.
Yeah. If I move to the next one, then.
Oh, then we could both stay.
If I may, Martin Boyle from Nominus again. Yes, I accept what Avery says, that there are some CCTLDs that behave as if they were GTLDs, but at the end of the day, their prime responsibility is to serve their local community, and I still believe that their local community is the right place for that accountability to take place. There is a separate set of accountability, though, if and I start off by saying, better start off by saying that Nominet does not have a UK based only policy. We have about 5%, perhaps as much as 5% of our registry that is registered from outside the UK. That's 5% of 10 million domain names, so it's quite a substantial number. But the people who take a domain name from us are subject to law under the UK for the contract. And we would actually expect complaints to be dealt with under UK law. And that I would see as being the direct accountability structure. So and so even with registries that are acting entirely like a GTLD, their customers, so long as their customers are aware that they are signing a contract under that particular jurisdiction, and that's what the contract says, that choice is their choice. And therefore, I would still go back and say that the accountability has to be local. And I'm feeling vibes from my left that there might not be uniform consensus on there.
Thank you. Avridoria speaking again, and I neglected to introduce myself last time, so I apologize. By that token, you know, because I don't think we're just looking at TLD type organizations, we're looking at any organization. So we could look at the IT, well, no, they've been chartered by the UN. It's within the UN that we should look at their accountability. A GTLD, no, there's compliance from ICANN, that should really be enough. They signed a contract with ICANN, so, you know, shouldn't they be governed under that? The looking at the IGF even as an accountable organization, well, no, that has a UN, you know, initiation, so that should be looked at under a UN system. It's basically sort of taking these systems, and I think even when you get to the law may not cover all of the accountability issues that you may have. You may have a law that actually encourages things that are not accountable. Certainly not in the UK, but, you know, elsewhere. You know, I don't mean to say anything like that. So I think that if we're going to say that there's a dynamic coalition that can presume to do, and of course it would have to do it in a reasonable way. It would have to do it in a way that made sense, that, you know, when people read it, they sort of went, well, who are these people? They didn't even talk to the people in country. You know, so obviously, if you were doing accountability of a national organization, you would want to make sure that you primarily dealt with that. But if the law said that it was okay for that national organization to infringe against the laws of another country, the accountability issues would be open and discussable. So I don't really understand limiting something for that national reason.
So Izumi, I have a question about what we're going to do in terms of, are we going to like review and analyze and sort of like, like scrutinize accountability of certain organization, or are we sharing best practices, as Jorge has mentioned? I kind of quite like that idea of sharing best practices, because we don't have the expertise and we don't know the structure of different organizations. For example, like the case of CCTLDs, but not limited. I don't know an environment, for example, like, in Brazil, and whether this CCTLD in Brazil is accountable enough. I don't have enough knowledge to be able to evaluate and say, yep, Brazil, it's great, or, so I think collecting the best practices from those who are involved, and then maybe by people reading it, we can learn from it. I like that approach.
Martin Boyle here again. Yes, I think Izumi is entirely right. It depends on what you're trying to do with it. And sharing good practice and understanding how different countries, how different organizations manage that accountability structure could help people understand what might work in their own environment and might not. I guess, though, that when we start turning around and saying, well, we're looking into these things, ITU, it's a United Nations body. It has its own accountability structures. And I think it would be ridiculous of us to expect us to be able to turn around and tell the ITU that its accountability structures were not right. That's not our role or responsibility, to quote back to an earlier text. And it's something that I think would be seen as being inappropriate on our behalf. However, looking and identifying what is good, what is useful about the ITU structure, could be something that helps inform us when we think about how to engage with governments within our own area of activity, or how to engage with sector members or industrial stakeholders as a sort of translation between the ITU framework of working and the way that ICANN would work. But how much of that would be transferable as skills and expertise? Having worked in both environments, I think it's probably fairly limited, but that's just a personal opinion.
Okay, I'm getting confused, so forgive me. First of all, I don't understand why, if all we were doing was best practices, and I never quite understood that that was the intent of this, to be a accountability best practice group, then why the UK wouldn't want us to look at them. Because we'd obviously be able to learn great things about how to be accountable by looking at them if best practice was all we were doing. Right, but before you were basically speaking about we shouldn't be looking at a CCTLD. So, but going on from there, and then I'm sure we can, but no, actually they'll stop us sooner or later. In terms of it being out of scope for the IGF, I don't know that that's the case. And certainly this is a dynamic coalition we're talking about and not the IGF per se. But in terms of looking at accountability factors and measuring organizations against a certain set, it's something that we did as early as the WIGIG, out of which the IGF grew. And actually, there's always been a presumption that the IGF would, in some sense, be able to look at accountability mechanisms and measure organizations against those mechanisms. And so I'm not sure that I accept the question that it's out of scope for, you know, there's no enforcement, there's nothing, it has no meaning other than this is a report that may or may not be interesting to people from a dynamic coalition. But I see no barrier to doing that. And as I said, we did it in the WGIG. My first encounter was with ICANN as an organization was when WGIG sent me to ICANN to help describe its accountability. You know, I obviously have been doing that ever since, but you know, that was something we did. So I'm not sure that it's out of scope. It's not an official IGF position, but it's a dynamic coalition thingy.
Okay, thank you very much. This has been a really robust and lively discussion, and I think it's exactly what we can now take to the mailing list and talk about further about what are some ideas that we can do and what are the appropriate for us to look at. I think the best practices idea is a good one, although I wouldn't limit it there. I also like the idea of talking about the criteria that Jan talked about earlier. Is an organization transparent? Is there opportunities for redress? Is there opportunities for access? Things like that. And looking at the different organizations in the space and doing some evaluations about how accountable they are under those criteria. So that's just another suggestion to sort of throw out there. But I really would like to get us thinking and starting to think about what is the best use that we could make for this coalition in terms of impacting accountability in internet governance for us. So with that, we have to wrap it up because we're a little bit over time already. So I would like to encourage you all to join the Dynamic Coalition, and I'll give the address again to go to. So it's mailman.netgov-accountability.org, and then I think you need a /listinfo/discuss. And you could join there, or you can send me an email to Robin, R-O-B-I-N, at ipjustice.org. And I'd like to thank our panelists for coming today, and our audience, and let's take this discussion back online and come back next year with some work behind us. Thank you very much.